So, let's have questions for our panelists. Yes. We're going to reiterate the conversation, the questions. I'll reiterate the questions for the camera. What's in our seed bombs?
Not Missouri, but Midwest. So Midwest region wildflower mix. These are annual.
Thank you. Another question. Yes, Dave.
Kyra, when you were comparing 1910, 1937 data to present day, one of the variables I guess you addressed was how prolific or how abundant was the population of the non-native honeybees. Could you comment on that question?
And would you reiterate the question kind of as you answer, please, Kyra?
So you asked about the abundance of the pollinators, particularly the non-native honeybee. I don't have hard numbers on that. Part of it is that our sampling of the insects is very new this year. We've been focused on the plants for the last 6 years, and just in this last year we've started to bring in the pollinator piece. I focus on building the current data set for pollinators, and we've just started to, so we just took a sampling actually of the historical bees, if you want to call it that, initially as a proof of concept. We had to prove that time didn't make a difference for how much pollen a bee was carrying, right? Can you understand? Like, in other words, you know, if the old bees, just from handling and knocking about, lost their pollen, then that would completely bugger up our data set. And so we got a beautiful lack of correlation in that the old bees and the current bees carry very similar amounts of pollen. Absolutely no, in that sense. However, what I don't have yet is abundance for the bees collected from back then. So I can't address your question directly, but we are documenting the sampling of the native bees versus the non-native bees. One of the things that we're hindered by is that, much like Edgar Anderson with his plants, we were hindered in that he didn't pay attention to things that weren't flowering. And so that's a big hole in the data set. And then he didn't like to collect a lot of things in July for obvious reasons. Thank goodness for the green lull, because I think he just wouldn't have gone out. But with the bees, it's that, and this is going to sound funny, but you're a little hindered by anybody who collects, and this happens in plants too, they like new things. They like to collect what hasn't been already collected. So it's a little hard to gauge what the abundance were of the honeybees, because once you have one, no one wants to collect another one. They want to collect what's rare. So the sampling bias is towards what was present and not so much how many we had in terms of the bees. But we do have some sense in that the presence and absence of them in each year, we can document that. And that's a pattern that we'll be documenting. But what I can say is there is data to come in that direction, but probably not in the capacity that will make you happy. Sufficient, if that answers.
Thank you. Another question? Well, yes.
Thank you. They must have liked it because they kept coming back. And you know, these were times when life wasn't as easy as it is now. You look at the James expedition, for example, in 1920, which was the first government-funded scientific expedition in the United States to come out and basically redo Lewis and Clark from a scientific standpoint. And the first botanist made it about as far as Boonville, and he expired. So they had to go back east and pick up another botanist and meet up with him in the Kansas City area. So the fact that these men, and they mostly were men, were willing to subject themselves to this level of discomfort and continue to do that meant that it must have been fulfilling to them in some form or fashion. And I'm sure that they weren't just all very mercenary about it. I'm sure that there was a spiritual component to that as well, because there's something intrinsically cool about exploring, going places where people haven't done stuff before and seeing new stuff. It's really cool.
I have a question for you, Kyra. Would you talk a little bit, would you explain what happens with Goat Week and Japanese honeysuckle on the Maryville campus?
Yes, I think there was a hand
Well,
first.
go ahead. Well, first Goat Week, and then we'll get to that question. Dave, you already asked one question. It's my turn. Thank you.
Dave, was your question for me? Was your question going to be
We
for-
want to know about Goat Week.
Okay, we'll talk about Goat Week. So, as George showed you, honeysuckle is a problem on Maryville campus, just like everywhere. But the thing is that we actually have aerial photographs that show when it showed up, which was around 1996. Prior to that, there was not honeysuckle on our campus, and now that's all there is on our campus. And I had some very proactive students who took these aerial photographs and dug the other ones out of the archives and demonstrated, when it had shown up, which I think is just fascinating. And then, again, this is a very student-driven project. They started to explore, how do we address taking care of our campus, the stewardship of campus, and the invasive honeysuckle. And I pointed out to them, be creative, because we have no funding, and you're going to have to get people excited about pulling weeds. And they did. So they took a two-pronged approach, because you have the adult honeysuckle, these trees, and then you also have the juveniles, all the little ones that pop up in the spring that, you almost don't even know what to do with them, because they're hard to identify and they're everywhere, and it's such a pain. So with the adults, they made them not weeding but harvesting. So we chop them down, and they've made all sorts of things out of them, paper and fire starters, and then sell them and use the proceeds from that as our funding to manage the honeysuckle. So it's starting to pay for itself. And then with the juveniles, and this is really where they started to learn about the biology of the plant and use it against it. And so in my class, I talked with them about how the reason it's invasive, all the reasons it's invasive, one of those reasons is because it's the first thing to pop up in the spring. And it has about 2 or 3 weeks where that's it. It grows first, it grows fast, it shades out the natives, it wins. But it also shows its hand. And so those are the weeks where we bring goats to Maryville campus. And that's Goat Week. And goats are magnificent. They aren't pesticides. There's no chemicals. Everybody gets excited about goats. They do a little fertilizing along the way. And it's my kind of weeding where you sit in a lawn chair with a cold beverage and watch your goats. And by the way, they eat honeysuckle baby plants like champions. And of course, because we had a couple aspects to Goat Week. We had our initial year last year. It will be again this year, and we'll send out an e-blast promoting that. We made it an education event. We have a tent, we have flyers for children and flyers for adults. Sometimes those get mixed up. I think it's funny when people don't notice, including the president of our university. This does not leave this room. But he picked up the flyer for children, and he thought it was just a great, really interesting, and walked off. And I went, "Thank you." But and we have a whole green walk that as people visit our campus, they stop at all the stations of the goat, is what it eventually got called, to see honeysuckle, the experiments being done, and then all the way down to where the goats were. And they had them eating in a grid, goat, no goat. And I have some very interesting first-year data from that. The impact on what kind of biodiversity we saw with spraying versus goats versus natural areas. And so that's Maryville's Goat Week. And one of my favorite pieces to that is that people say, well, when is Goat Week? And I say, when is spring? And administrators just hate that because they like to have things on some sort of budget schedule 4 years in advance. But nature is nature. So Goat Week is 2 weeks after the first plants pop up. And that's when we send out the information. And we really like to have children and outside groups come in and see what our goats are up to and how that works. So that's Goat Week.
Thank you. a plug for goat cheese too, and for Mayor Slay proposing that the City Board of Aldermen allow an ordinance for people to keep goats as well as chickens.
Well,
This
I
could be progress
I
in
should
the
point
city of
out,
St. Louis.
the entire idea, the thing from start to finish, is completely from my students' driving ideas. I just try to keep them from doing anything illegal. And it's completely, the team that created this included environmental education students, business, and art students. And so it looks good, too.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Actually, the St. Louis Zoo works that way as well, because they brought goats into Forest Park to help with harvest of the.
Yeah, it's not a new idea. Google uses goats.
Thank you. Lydia?
Ah, yes. So they are in-house goats. They are one of our students, and she has a farm and she has goats. And so remember, we had no money. So she was on the team and she brought her goats. And then, distressingly, although it turned out to be a marketing coup, one of the goats in our first year was pregnant. I'm a botanist. I had no idea what this goat was up to. And we put 5 goats to bed in the trailer and woke up to 6 goats. And her name's Baby Barrett, named after one of the founding nuns of Maryville. And everybody came down to see Baby Barrett because she was born on campus, which means she's a citizen of Maryville. And we trot her out quite frequently. She's become our best marketing tool. Botanists have to do these kinds of things. You have to use a goat to garner attention for your plants. So that's where the goats come from currently. But our idea is that there would be a partnership. There's lots of people with goats in really not that far outside the city, that if you have something you would like consumed, to link those people up. They want to feed their goats and you don't want to weed.
A couple of other questions?
There was.
Dave?
I'd like to address this to the botanists. As a product of our urbanization, it seems like a lot of our green areas have shrunk. How do you envision using these conservation areas, forests, and other areas to maybe repopulate the repopulating areas of urban areas?
How can we use green areas to repopulate the urban area?
There. I think first we have to repopulate the minds of people about biodiversity, because this element of generational amnesia sets in, and for a lot of people that are living in this current generation, that's an optimum setting for biodiversity in these areas. And they can hardly imagine a world that looks different. So the first kind of repopulating in terms of biodiversity begins with helping people imagine a world that looks different, and that normal looks different from what is in front of them. And in that sense, it will take, I think, several kinds of approaches to this, because the valuable information that's contained in this somehow has to percolate to communities and people and initiatives that can start creating a new sense of normal, so that we can perceive the loss, so that we can address the loss. Because a lot of parks, the whole movement for parks was about moving away from biodiversity and moving to a setting where it was manageable and clean and safe. And it is now that we're starting to think that a park that looks like grass with a few trees is an aberration. But for most of the 20th century, half of the 19th century, that was what you wanted. And so it's really kind of an anthropological question of sorts. And again, it's where things like seed bombing become such a cool idea, because it is an ingenious, small way of getting a few people to think of the world differently, and then make it so. That one thing that I love in my conversation with Catherine the first time I talked to her is that she used this idea that this is an action. When you take this and throw it, you are seeding biodiversity. these kids are not just writing a letter or giving money or doing a paper or reading a book or going out in the woods and having reflective action. They are throwing something that will change the way the world looks. So I wanted to add that because I know there is a lot of scientific stuff that we can do to change. Again, we understand it. We understand where to begin, but in order to begin, we have to need to begin. And for a lot of people, there's no need to begin because the world looks like it should. They don't remember that there is no memory of that loss yet. So we have to begin there.
I think that many of these situations in urban areas are incredibly complicated. And when we design projects to try to improve green space and improve what we might call the urban wilderness, it turns out that not all of the constituency may initially be on the same page. And the things that you intend to accomplish with these projects are often subject to public perception. So I think that, for example, when you go in and you improve Kennedy Forest in Forest Park, or you do the incredible plantings that were done just north of there along the edge of the park, I think that what you need to do is to make people feel that these areas are special. And I think that you need to develop that in a way so that special is thought of a little differently. On the one hand, these are ways to encourage people to sort of invest spiritually in nature. The idea being that these people will go out, see something new, become enthused about it, and sort of buy into the big concept. It turns out that getting people out can be a problem. And frequently the goals of the groups that are invested heavily in green space, for example, may at times be at odds with the people who are more interested in the restoration of nature. Sometimes putting a big trail to get to an area can ruin that area. So you not only need to define goals, but you need to sell them. And you need to sell them in a way such that your constituency is sort of all on the same page. I think that from the standpoint of urban planning, we have these little postage stamp size areas that retain their natural features, and I think that we can improve those areas. We can clean them up, we can remove some of the invasive exotics, we can, in some cases, plant new things, we can encourage pollinators to come in, but there is no connection between these areas. So from the standpoint of urban planning, we also need to look at how animals, in particular, are going to be able to move between these areas, because we know that many animals that reside in urban areas really do need to have effective ways of moving around. It's to sustain populations so that the boy animal and the girl animal can meet. It's to have them interact more with other things in the ecosystem. So I think that one of the key goals to urban planning in the context of natural areas, in addition to improving the areas you've got, is figuring out ways to sustainably connect these areas and do it in such a way that people remain enthused about the whole project and don't feel threatened because nature's coming a little too close to home.
We're going to take one more question because we're a little bit past our end time here, but I do want to remind you about the 2 flip charts right outside the room there. Ideas, possible projects. We'd love to have you sign up to be a connector to the Biodiversity St. Louis initiative. You can do that by email to biodiversitystl.org. And the lady in the green sweatshirt, you had a question? Would you like to? Yes, Adrián.
I would be totally remiss if I don't mention that the St. Louis Zoo currently has an amazingly ingenious pollinators project at work. And if you have any questions about it, because Yatskievych is here, you should ask him about it. It's an integration of community engagement in pollination and engagement of communities in Africa about pollination. And it's too long to explain completely, but it's a fantastic example of what you can do to, we were talking about getting people enthused about nature and pollination, to use that sense of adventure and exploration and discovery for that exotic world out there to have an impact in this world that we live in right now. So,
Yatskievych, where are you? There he
so if
is.
you have any questions, you should definitely ask him.
And isn't there a talk next week at the zoo about energy and biodiversity? Yes, when is that? When and where is that?
So the Harris Center for Something Ecology is putting together a panel that is actually kind of cool, because the panelists are going to talk about the future in energy, and it's mostly from the perspective of conservation biologists, but the challenge posed to the presenters is, what is the way forward? Not what's the, but what are clues that we have found of what is the way forward for wind, for hydro, for yes, and somebody's going to be talking about fracking, but again, we have posed as a challenge, tell us what needs to be done. What does your science say that needs to happen now? So if you want to hear about, again, small steps towards a solution, it's a really good thing to attend.
Thank you. One more question. Yes.
And I have the opportunity to work in hundreds of acres in St. County. We've been through lots of honeysuckle roundups, and the idea of goats is really interesting. You would bring in goats from surrounding areas if you recommend that.
So we have a lot of, experiments that we've done just in our first year, but most of them were looking at the honeysuckle and the impact of the goats on there. But I'm fairly certain about, you mean like goat eating rates?
Yeah, so I'm interested on keeping it from repopulating. We've been through roundups with mature honeysuckles gone.
Well, I'll tell you this, what we found was that where spraying had happened, Roundup, goats won't eat. So if you spray, the goats go,
So it happens first with you.
So yes, so when we would hack down the trees, we painted or very specifically sprayed into the roots, but not widespread spraying. First of all, that's terrible for pollinators. And you put chemicals everywhere, and then nothing else will grow. So in areas with spray, we didn't get honeysuckle, we also didn't get any natives, and we didn't get a lot of plants in general. The highest success with less honeysuckle, because of course it always comes back, but less honeysuckle, the most plants, this bear in mind is 1 year of data, was in the goat-treated areas. And it was statistically significant for 1 year. We are going to do this for a while. Of course it comes back. Yes. This is, that's why I often have people go, well, once you cut it down, isn't the project done? Clearly they haven't been around honeysuckle. Okay, so you mean like the eating rates of goats. I would defer you, and I'd give you information about my goat keeper student. I don't know the rates of goat consumption. I know that they cleared a fairly large, I can give you actual dimensions of that, what 5 goats did in a week, eating for 4 hours a day. Actually, although I'll tell you this, our juvenile male goat was the monster eater. But that's no surprise, right? Anybody with teenage sons? Yeah.
I'm going to close the program here officially tonight. If you have other questions for our presenters or you'd like to discuss, we'd be happy to have you do that. On behalf of Biodiversity St. Louis at the Missouri Botanical Garden and our presenters tonight, Dr. George Yatskievych, Dr. Kyra Krakos, Dr. Adrián Cerezo, please give them a hand. Thank you again very much for coming. Please connect with us via biodiversitystl.org, and we look forward to seeing you at the next events.